Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Eric Swensen. Eric has been with the University of Virginia Health System's Strategic Relations and Marketing Department since 2006. He's writing for and editing a variety of publications and websites. He has served as UVA's Health System's Public Information Officer since 2011. That's 8 years, and he's still here talking about it. Eric will be discussing what he learned in his role as PIO after the tragic 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. Eric, come on up.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Well, good morning, everybody. Before I start, anytime I talk about this, and I've done a few presentations on this over the years, it's always with some mixed feelings, because the only reason I'm up here and not in the audience listening is because we did have something truly horrible happen in Charlottesville that day, now coming up on about 2 years ago. And I always think about the family of the young woman who was murdered that day, and the other counter protesters who were badly injured. And I know we treated about 20 folks that day, and there were, I think, all told about 35 or so people who were treated for injuries that day at that white supremacist rally. So it's always, I'm glad to share my experiences, and hopefully we can all learn from some of that, and I certainly look forward to your questions. That's, I always try to start with that, because it's, in a lot of ways, I'd rather not be up here. I'd rather be sitting with y'all at one of the tables, listening to somebody else talk about their experiences. So I guess before I start, knowing that I think Charlottesville's a little bit different from what y'all deal with up here in this region, just a quick little something about the UVA Health System. So again, we're based in Charlottesville, home to this year's NCAA national champions in men's basketball. I'm now required to say that every time I do a presentation. And we are essentially the academic medical center for really the western half of Virginia. So we're based in Charlottesville, which, if you haven't been, is about 2.5 hours or so south of Washington, D.C. And we serve a huge region. We have dialysis centers, outpatient clinics that range from Winchester, Virginia, which is about 2 hours northwest of Charlottesville, all the way down to around the Roanoke area, which is about 2 hours southwest of us. So we cover a huge area of Virginia. We routinely have patients come to us from 4, 5, even 6 hours away for specialty care. So it's we serve a very wide area, which can sometimes present its own challenges. But at our main hospital in Charlottesville, we're about 600-bed hospital, level 1 trauma center, good size ED, and we're really the place you come in the western half of Virginia for that tertiary and quaternary, that really complex care and the serious trauma cases. So this is a scene, and I noticed as I was coming in for registration, I saw some folks, some first responders, some folks from law enforcement, and I think I always like to start with this photo simply because you see a lot of our folks in our command center. This is the day after the rally with the then governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, and this is just a tiny fraction of the people who really made this happen. And I'm up here today because of the excellent work that was done by dozens and dozens and dozens of people throughout the health system. Our security, our emergency management team, doctors, nurses. I mean, I could spend 45 minutes just running through all the various groups of people who, were able to help us, be successful in taking care of the patients we saw that day. And I think, hearing other speakers here this morning talk about the importance of coordination and teamwork, and I think especially within your own hospitals, that's so important to have, a large, engaged team that, you're all on the same page. And the only way that you can be successful as a PIO or successful as a member of a leadership team is to really have everybody at your hospital, your health system, really actively engaged in kind of the emergency management, both response and planning process. So I'm going to walk you through all of this over the next few minutes. So this is kind of a rundown of what I'm going to talk about. The importance of sort of learning from what you've dealt with previously, some of the key elements you should have in your plan, the 3 phases of response, a little bit about how we responded during the day of the rally on August 12th, 2017, how some of the things that you can do with sort of planning for expected events can also help you respond to unexpected crises, And then really the importance of really that the act of planning is more important than the actual whatever written plan you may end up having. So start with, learn from past events. And I think, obviously, this region here, in Taunton, close to Boston, very different from where I work in Charlottesville, a much larger media market here than in Charlottesville. So you're gonna have different relationships with reporters. You're gonna have, different relationships with other hospitals. For instance, in Charlottesville, we have one other fairly small community hospital and a couple of other small community hospitals near us. So that definitely changes how we do emergency response, where in the case of a major emergency, the vast majority of those patients are coming to us. So we think about it differently than you might in a region like this, where you have a group of hospitals that might be more easily able to work together. And we have different relationships with the media. Depending on the relationships you have with folks, that might influence how you plan and how you respond. So here are some of the key events in our past that sort of informed my thinking as we started to plan for this white supremacist rally in August of 2017. This is now going back now close to 5.5 years, and you may or may not remember this. It got some national news coverage at the time. Creed Deeds, who's a state senator still in Virginia, he had run both for Attorney General and Governor of Virginia. And he was attacked at his home by his son, who had some very serious mental health issues. And he was badly injured, and he was flown to our hospital from his home, which was about 90 minutes away from Charlottesville. And so we had a little bit of time before the media got word of it, and then once they got word of it, because his home is so isolated, they all came to the hospital. And it was, in those first few hours, as people kind of started to flood in, it was a bit of chaos. And a big challenge for us that day was that the area we had used at the hospital as a staging area for many, many years had literally within a month or two had started to go into use as a construction staging area. So it was no longer available to me, no longer available to the media. So folks just kind of found spots. And if you've dealt with the media, you know this. The media will kind of find its way in wherever they can, they'll go as far as you'll allow them. And so we had folks in the lobby, we had folks right outside the front door, we had photographers, video cameras. It was a lot, and I was still relatively new in my role, and you sort of have to, again, sort of act on the fly and sort of push people out. But it really, sort of forced me to think about where's a good place to put the media that sort of gives them what they need, which is essentially kind of a backdrop of the hospital that shows that they're there at the medical center, but also kind of keeps them out of the way, because there were points where, we had other patients who were trying to get into the medical center who were having to kind of work around, photographers and, TV crews. And so it was not working for us. So how do you deal with that? And then also a big challenge that day was, what information do we want to provide? I mean, I know for, the sort of the standard patient, there's always the sort of the one-word condition: good, fair, serious, critical. But, in that case, we had to have a discussion with his family, knowing he was a public figure, a public servant. What do we want to provide? So I had that discussion with them that day, and it got me to thinking about, well, if we ever had a mass casualty incident where we had 10, 15, 20, 30 people, what are we going to share, and what are the ways to best share it? And probably the most important lesson I learned from that week was the importance of kind of assembling a public information team to really help you do your job. I'm part of a bigger department, but I'm one of 2 people who does public relations on a full-time basis. I have other folks who I can kind of pull from for assistance when I need it. But that week, I basically tried to do it all myself. And so Senator Deeds was brought to us on Tuesday morning, and he was released Friday morning. And so basically, it felt like all I did from Tuesday morning through Friday morning was work. It was 14, 16-hour days. I was up, out at the staging area. We settled on at 6 in the morning. I was still working till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, taking requests. When he was released Friday, my boss told me to go home and go to bed. I got into bed, and I couldn't sleep, not because I didn't want to sleep, but because the phone kept ringing. People texted me, emails, like the phone just kept pinging and ringing, all afternoon, sort of confirming that he had been released, he had gone home, and that we had nothing else we could share. Even though we had said we had nothing else we could share, they wanted to confirm that with me. So the importance of really trying to assemble a team, think about how you work in shifts is really important, because at a certain point you're going to burn yourself out, and especially if it's an ongoing issue or crisis that might last multiple days, you are going to get tired and you're going to make mistakes simply because you're not properly rested. And then the other event that really led us to really start thinking more about what we were going to do for this white supremacist rally actually happened a month prior to that. There was another rally which got less attention because there was no there was no disorder, there were no attacks, but about a month earlier, the KKK, which, believe it or not, still does exist, held a rally. It was a small rally in Charlottesville, and only about 15 or 20 folks showed up from the KKK, but they were met by, I would say, at least 500 counter-protesters. And so there's the challenge of keeping them apart, and it really, again, got us to thinking about, if violence had broken out this day, well, what are we going to say, and how do we keep the media safe distance away? Because as we started to plan for the event in July, and as we started to think about knowing that this white supremacist rally had been given a permit and was coming in August of 2017, one of the things that we thought about was that, and this was not my decision, but our emergency management and our emergency department team decided that if we had a mass influx of patients, we were going to use our lobby as a triage area. And basically the front of our lobby is essentially just, it's a sort of a semicircle, and it's all glass enclosed. So if you were to walk by on any normal day, you'd see people waiting for family members. But suddenly, when it becomes a treatment area, now all the HIPAA rules apply to that treatment area. So you've got to figure out how do we keep folks away and sort of find a good place for them to stage and be able to do their live shots if they want to do that, and sort of again keep them away from being able to actually see people receiving treatment at the hospital. So what are some of the key elements that you need in a plan as you start to think about if you know an event is coming? So I think that probably the first and most important one is, what questions are you going to get asked? And that can, depending on the size and the scope of the event, that may be both what are you going to get asked during the event, but even before the event, what are you going to get asked? I mean, certainly the local media reached out to us in the week or two leading up to that event, wanting to know about our preparations, wanting to know that we were ready to go in case we did get a large influx of patients, and we had to deal with an issue where word got out. We didn't put this out, but word got out because I think some people were not happy about it, that we decided the weekend of the rally to not schedule any elective surgeries. We wanted to make sure we had enough capacity in our operating rooms that if we did get a large number of people who needed surgery, that we had the staff and the ORs ready for them. And so you kind of had to manage that. And it's always going to be a balancing act. For myself as the PIO, I sort of tend to advocate for transparency, that we should just be upfront and tell people this is what we're doing, here's the plan, here's why we're doing it. Certainly if you have other positions in senior leadership at a hospital, you're not always, you have to sort of balance the how people are going to react to that and how much you actually want to share. So it's an important conversation to have, is if you're the person doing public relations, to have with your hospital leadership about what do we want to share, how detailed do we want to be. I mean, people weren't asking for our entire incident action plan, which is 20, 25 pages long, but they want to know that you're going to have extra staff there, that you've got sort of provisions and supplies, you have everything you need in place, so that if you do need to respond, you can. The next challenge, and I think this is always a challenge I think at a lot of hospitals, and certainly can be at ours, is how do you get accurate information? I think sometimes the electronic medical record can be both a help and a hurdle to doing that, depending on how well integrated it is to your system. And I think that was one of the things we started to think about is, if we're going to go out and say, for instance, hey, we've treated 20 people and we have this many in good condition, this many in fair, this many in serious, this many in critical, how are we going to know who are the patients that are actually we're treating as a result of this incident? How do we find out then what their conditions are? And so it's a massive undertaking, especially if you have 15 or 20 people. So you've got to think about how are we going to get that information. If there are other elements you need to include in that as well, you need to figure out ahead of time, not in the moment, who's the right person to ask, who actually has the information that you need, that you can rely on to provide you, not only in a timely manner, but provide accurate information. And then what's the best way to share that information? I think, the rise of social media, I heard somebody describe what used to be called the 24-hour news cycle as like the 24-second news cycle. It's like an NBA shot clock, where there's just a desire for this sort of endless, these endless series of updates. Everyone wants a little nugget of news they can claim as their own, or they have a breaking piece of news. So how do you get that information out and maintain some semblance of control so that you're not spending the entire time, your entire day just responding to every kind of one-off request that comes in? A big one, and again, this is going to very much vary by your hospital and sort of where you're situated, is where's a good staging area for the media? You want a place, again, that is sort of is visible, that has, the hospital or the helipad or something in the backdrop, so that somebody goes live from the scene, that everybody can place that they're at the medical center, but place them in such a way that they are nowhere near, the actual business of running a hospital. Because I will say, even when, even this day, as terrible as this day was, we got this influx of about 20 or so patients. We had, a nearly full hospital. We had another 500 plus patients in the hospital, and we had patients coming and going. We had, visitors and family coming and going. We had our staff, coming in and out for shift changes, and you've got to be able to accommodate all of those people coming and going in addition to taking care of this major event. I talked a little bit about this before, but again, thinking about how big a team do I need? Do we need to work in shifts? And a lot of that is going to be based on how long you think the event is going to last. Is this going to be something that's going to last an afternoon, last an entire day, last an entire weekend, last an entire week? And you need to think carefully about, how many people do I need? What roles do I need people to play? And how many people do I need to sort of rotate through to sort of keep everybody fresh and have everybody sort of operating at their peak efficiency? And then what do hospital employees need to know? We were talking a little bit about this at the table this morning as we were eating breakfast. And I think there was probably a time, and I'm sure people who have worked in hospitals longer than I have might correct me on this, but I feel like 15, 20 years ago, if you were a doctor, you were a nurse, you come in to work your shift, you kind of go into a bubble. Back then there were no electronic records, there were probably very few computers, you charted on paper, you came in, you did your work, you saw your patients, you took care of your patients, you moved from room to room, and then you kind of emerged from the bubble at the end of your shift, whether it was 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever it might be, and you kind of rejoin the rest of the world. And now, I think in any hospital, I know it's true at our hospital, there are computers all over the place because you've got to chart electronically on that electronic health record, and it just makes it easier. And you combine that with cell phones, where again, most of our doctors, most of our nurses are using that even to communicate with each other, responding to pages during the day. So for instance, the day of August 12th, our own staff could watch in real time what was unfolding in downtown Charlottesville. They could pull it up on a computer, they could pull it up on their phone, they could have friends text them, call them, say, hey, did you hear what's happening? It's terrible. So everybody knows, and you've got to think about how do you, what information do they need to hear? How do you reassure them? You need to tell them about the best ways to get in and out of the hospital. There's a lot that goes into now where I think, again, 15 or 20 years ago, you could just kind of tell them, here's the route to take to work. You don't really need to worry about them again until their shift's over and you tell them how to go home. So the 3 phases of response, and this is pretty basic. So again, it's the preparations for the event, it's during the event and after the event. So again, I talked a little bit about the preparations, for the event, and again, depending on, sort of how big in scale and scope the event is, you may get some questions about what you're doing to prepare. You may get questions from your staff about, what are you doing to prepare? And I think what we've learned for a variety of reasons over the years is that, a way to cut down on a lot of the issues that crop up where people, leak information or share information with the media that you would rather not share with them, is to be upfront with them. And I think what we've seen at UVA, and again, Peter mentioned in the introduction, I've been here about 13 years, and when I first joined UVA, we certainly, more things kind of got out now than they do now. I think a lot of that is we've worked very hard at internal communication and really, talking with our own staff about here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And I think a lot of times when you give them that why, you give them a chance to ask questions, to express their concerns, and they know before everybody else knows. That gives them, more of a sense of, of buy-in and just a sense that they're engaged with what's going on and how the hospital is working. Certainly during the event, you're going to, again, depending on the size and scope of things, you may be getting anywhere from, a handful of requests to dozens of requests to hundreds of requests, depending on how big a story it becomes. And I'll tell you that even after the event, we got requests related to what happened on August 12th for more than a year after that weekend. We had, questions about some fundraising we were doing to help folks with their bills. We have people following up with individual patients who were injured during the rally. So you'll get all sorts of questions. And again, you can't really anticipate them, but know that probably your work is not done when the event is done. So here's a little bit about how we responded that day on August 12th. So we had a 3-person team on site that day, and again, not knowing what to expect, we didn't really plan to have shifts, we sort of said we'll have this initial 3-person group and then we'll kind of see where things go. And so we had one person really to kind of essentially help gather some information for me. She was the person I tasked to kind of find out where the patients who were injured were, what their conditions were, and also help collect media requests and sort of gather them up. And what we did with a lot of those, a lot of folks just emailed, found our, we have a newsroom page on our website. We have a list of media contacts, and a lot of folks just grabbed all those email addresses and just emailed everybody on the page and said, please, give us updates on the people who were injured. And so I had that person in charge essentially of just collecting all of those emails, responding to them saying, we're still gathering information, we'll give you an update as soon as we can, and then is putting all of those into basically one giant, blind carbon copy email so we could send everybody the same information at the same time. Had one person, one of my colleagues, focused mainly on internal communications, just around, again, telling people, what streets to avoid on their way into the hospital, because we do, just as we serve patients from a large region, we also have our staff who actually travel from a fairly large region to come work with us. We have a lot of folks who work 3-day shifts, so they may live an hour away from the hospital. And so we have a lot of folks who are coming in from sort of all sides of the medical center. And so we want to give them some instruction on how to get in safely. And then also we certainly, anticipated questions and got additional questions that day about security and walking people to their cars, wanting to make people feel that, they are safe, getting in and out of their job. And then my role as the PIO was essentially either, depending on the situation, you needed to write or edit all the communications and then respond to any on-site media who showed up. We did get not much. I think I actually helped direct more people who were lost looking for a press conference than actually were looking for us. But we did have some people, some of our local media folks who we'd sent our statement out about the number of people injured, their conditions, and one of the local TV stations who we deal with multiple times a week wanted me on camera to basically read the statement. And because I had a relationship with them, I was willing to do that, go out to the staging area and do that. And also, we had kind of essentially set up a perimeter kind of around the entrance. There's a road that kind of runs right through the middle of our medical center complex. And so we'd sort of set up security and blocked off the road at both ends. And so every hour or two, I'd go out and kind of walk the perimeter and just see, what was going on out there, if anybody was out there, if there was anything, that I needed to deal with, and, with the cell phone with me at all times so that people could find me if they needed me. We did have a social media coordinator working remotely from her apartment who was monitoring social media and was coordinating responses with the 3 of us who were working in our hospital command center, which was set up across the street from the main inpatient hospital. And we used her a lot. She was sort of helping us in terms of getting questions in on Twitter and Facebook, questions that our own staff had or that the community had, but then also proactively sharing that same information, trying to push out through our official channels information about road closures, about the number of patients we were treating. So again, kind of amplify the work that we were doing in hopes of, again, sort of slowing the volume of emails and phone calls that we were getting from the media. And in that weekend and in the weeks and even months that followed, we received hundreds, if not thousands, of media requests. We heard from obviously folks locally, across the state, across the region, national and international media. And as I mentioned before, we received related media requests for more than a year. Certainly the first anniversary, we got a lot of inquiries, again, asking us to kind of, talk about, what we saw and the folks we treated. Obviously in a situation like this, it also, certainly exposed some real serious issues that I think a lot of communities have, but really, in Charlottesville kind of brought those issues of racial equality, racial justice to the fore. And as a large employer, as part of a university that's been around since 1819, we were part and parcel of that. We certainly, for instance, actually renamed one of our medical school buildings for the only African-American graduate of our School of Medicine class in 1967, and renaming that building in her honor, and in, sort of changing the name from a building that had been named for a previous dean who was a proponent of eugenics. So it sort of brings these things to the fore, and even if you don't necessarily think it's part of what you do, I think anytime an event like this happens, it may cause folks to kind of re-examine, your institution's history, so you have to think about that as well. So what are some of the key takeaways that I learned that I want to share with you? I think the most important thing you can do, and if nothing else for your own sanity as much as anything else, is really to kind of control the tempo of the information you share with the media. Again, the media as any of you who work with them on a regular basis know, is insatiable. They will hound you for for information. And I'm an ex-reporter. I mean, I would have done the same thing. And folks are doing their jobs, and that's what they're there for. But I think you can really kind of set the tempo by telling them, okay, and we tried to do this in that first day. We said, all right, our next update is going to be Sunday morning around 9 a.m. Provide the information, the next update, then say, all right, our next update is going to be Sunday afternoon. And just make clear to them, listen, nothing's going to change before we send out the next update to this email list. So don't feel like you're missing anything if you don't see anything from us. It means we're basically gathering the information for the next update. So just be patient with us. And again, that helped sort of slow the flow of phone calls and emails that were, and even social media messages that were seeking information from us. It kind of helped us then focus on some of the other things that we needed to do. So at the beginning, I showed you that picture of the governor of Virginia coming to visit the command center that day after, and I actually spent much of my night, Saturday night, and then part of Sunday morning coordinating a visit for him, the Attorney General, and the Lieutenant Governor all to come to our command center because they wanted to meet with our staff. And if I had been answering 200 phone calls, it would have been a lot harder to kind of coordinate that visit. Given all the revelations about Facebook, it's kind of hard to say with a straight face that social media can be your friend. I know a lot of people probably have a very different opinion of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all these other channels. But again, in a situation like this, social media can be your friend. It can help you, again, sort of share your message, whatever your message may be. In this case, it's condition updates, but it can be anything you want to push out there about your institution, how you're responding, what you're doing. Again, it's a way to sort of share it in an official manner. Here's what's going on. You can have people share that, retweet it, share it on Facebook. And it's a way to sort of get people the information they're looking for, the information they need, without necessarily having to call you seeking it. Now, on the flip side to that, as again we were talking before about with the onset of social media, the onset of cell phones with video and photos and audio capabilities. The flip side to that is obviously you have to be very careful about your own staff and what they're taking pictures of and sharing on their own social media accounts. We had a couple of kind of, I would say, near misses where people posted some things that if they had taken that photo a few minutes later, might have contained photos of patients. So I think you always need to be mindful as well with your own staff to kind of remind them that, listen, if you share stuff on social media that has some kind of protected health information, that's a HIPAA violation. And I think I've never seen it where it's been done with any kind of ill intent. I think people are proud of the efforts of their colleagues, and they want to share the good work that their team members are doing. But I think you always have to be mindful and remind your staff, your doctors, your nurses to be careful about what they share on social media. And again, I think I learned this back in 2013, was reminded of it in July of 2017, was certainly reminded of it again, is again the importance of building a team and getting some rest. And this came up again last August when we had the 1-year anniversary of this white supremacist rally, and there were huge, there were these rumors of another white supremacist rally. There was a huge counter-protest planned. And so for the second time around, I essentially built 2 teams and said, we're going to work, we're going to have the command center staff 18 hours a day with kind of 9-hour shifts. We're going to have a little bit of overlap somewhere in the middle, and have folks kind of come in and rotate. I will tell you from my perspective as somebody who worked the day shift, when something actually kind of happened that night, I ended up coming back in, but it was even the act of getting a couple hours to go home and just relax and eat dinner and decompress for a few hours, even when I had to come back in to help out with the response that evening, it made, I think, a world of difference to me in being able to think clearly and then act clearly when events happened, again, suddenly and unexpectedly. And I will say that, I've talked a lot about sort of planning for an expected event, but I think the act of thinking about how you would respond to an event like this can really help you, even when something completely unexpected happens. And we had, unfortunately, some practice with that about 5 months after the August 2017 white supremacist rally. Again, you may or may not remember this. It briefly got some national attention. There was a charter train full of Republican members of Congress who were on their way from DC to a retreat in West Virginia. And so the train passes through Charlottesville and made it about 10 miles west of Charlottesville in a little town called Crozet, when it collided with the trash truck that had attempted to get across the train tracks. Turns out, I think they'd gotten sort of past the stop arm and got stuck on the tracks, and the train collided with the trash truck. So we had six victims of the crash brought to UVA, and it was nearly a month before the last victim was released. And so what we found was, having just gone through this 5 months earlier, that I was amazed at how quickly it kind of all fell into place where, even without thinking, there was no consulting a written plan. It was more just instinctual to say, okay, I need you to go gather the information on the patients. I need you to go work with security, make sure we've got, the streets blocked off. I'm gonna start answering questions. We had the additional challenge, given that we had members of Congress on the train, that we had the U.S. Capitol Police there. The FBI was there briefly, just to, until they kind of confirmed there was no, that this train was not targeted. This was an accident, which is what it was. It again gave me time to sort of be free to deal with some of the other sort of situations that were not necessarily directly related to the media, but sort of the other issues that may kind of crop up when you have these major events. So I found that it worked just as well, in dealing with an unplanned event as it is for a planned event, where you can really sort of think about the same things and say, okay, I'm going to grab these two people. We're going to be the first shift. If this goes on all night, I've got two other people designated to be the second shift, and then we'll think about the next day in the morning. So I want to leave you this final thought, and I think I've hopefully left plenty of time for questions, and I welcome any and all questions about this. Again, I've touched on this a little bit at a couple points in the presentation, but I think the act of planning and the act of sort of getting together to talk about how you'd respond to whether it's a mass casualty incident or any of the sort of scenarios that you go through on a regular basis is really important. But the act of planning is way more important than the actual kind of final written plan that you come up with, because unexpected things always happen. And I'll go back to the 1-year anniversary rally. And the night of the 1-year commemoration, there was a large rally that UVA students held at the Rotunda, which is sort of the main iconic. If you've ever seen a shot of UVA, it's that beautiful domed building on grounds at UVA. And there was a lot of security presence there, and again, not knowing who else might show up, and the students weren't happy with that, and so they began to march, and no one was really sure where they were marching towards. And at one point, they began marching towards the medical center. And not because we were afraid of the protesters or wanted to keep them away, but simply because we wanted to keep, again, our access roads clear for any emergency vehicles that may come, whether anything related to the rally or anything else. We serve such a wide area. Again, even as these major events go on, we have ambulances coming in from sometimes 2, 3, 4 hours away with patients. We've got to keep that area clear. So we closed off Lee Street, which is the main street that runs in front of our hospital. And we got questions about it. Why, these protesters are peaceful. Why are you closing the street off? And it had nothing to do with them. It simply had to do with, we need to make sure that, we assumed they were peaceful, but we need to keep that street clear. So I never in a million years could have predicted that we would suddenly have several hundred protesters marching towards the medical center, and that we'd have to do that and we'd get questions about it. But again, simply the act of thinking about how do we act, how do we respond, what security we need to have in place, all those things are so important to help you kind of respond to the moment, because there will always be things that are unexpected. I will admit this last slide is mostly an excuse to put Eisenhower and Mike Tyson on the same slide, which you hopefully will never see again. It was Eisenhower, and our director of emergency management, who at the time was the emergency management director for the health system, is now in that role for the entire university, is a big fan of the Eisenhower quote, which says, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." And of course, there was Mike Tyson, who once famously said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And a lot of times these situations, I mean, they come on, whether it's planned and then things really kind of go south, or there's an unplanned event, whether that's a mass casualty incident, it's maybe a gas leak, whatever it might be. Those things can kind of feel like a punch in the mouth, because at one moment you're sort of going about your daily business, and I know the only way I can say organized is with sort of a little to-do list where I kind of go through and cross off the items. And there are some days where, and the day of that train crash is a good example, I've gotten about a third of the way through that list, and I got a call. There's been a train crash. You need to come to the hospital right now. My offices actually happen to be about 10 minutes from the hospital because they don't let me near the patients generally. And so it's just drop everything, grab the laptop, and grab my phone, get in the car and go. And so it can feel kind of like a punch in the face, and you kind of have to gather yourself and respond. And I think if the more time you spend thinking about how you're going to do that, and I think from a PIO's perspective, a really important part is making sure that you have a seat at the table, both at the planning and then during the event itself. So we use kind of the standard, our former director of emergency management, who now does it for the entire university, is retired from the military, and so we use that kind of federal incident, kind of management command structure. And one of the nice things about that for PIOs is that under that structure, the PIO has a seat at the table with the incident commander and the director of emergency management. So it's the three of us at the table, and so I am fortunate enough to be right at the center of what's going on. So I'm as plugged in as I can be about what's happening. And I think if you're going to do effective response, whether it's to your own staff, whether it's to the media, whether it's to the wider public through your own social media channels, you need to be plugged in and have sort of a full awareness of what's going on to be able to respond in the most effective way possible. If you're, if you're kind of sidelined, if people kind of just pull you in and tell you to do stuff and then go do it, you can't hope to be anywhere near as effective as you can be if you're sort of plugged in and you can, not only have the information you need to make a response, but in some cases, offer your own opinion on, to your leadership on is what we're about to do a good idea? How will this play out with the public? How will the public respond? How will our own staff respond if we decide to do what you're proposing doing? So I think it's important, as the PIO, even though I'm not a medical professional, I think it's important for us to have that voice at the table where we can really, provide some valuable counsel to our leadership. So with that, I'll pause and see if anybody has any questions.
Great, thank you very much. Eric, you and I are going to have fun.
Okay.
Because of my background is similar to yours. So I was in the media for about 27 years.
Okay.
I was the news director at WBZ here in Boston for more than a decade, and then moved on to Brigham and Women's Hospital to be the head of public affairs and, in essence, the PIO in the Hicks system, whichever you prefer how to pronounce it. And so was right there at the center of it when events happened. And so I really want to commend the planning committee because this is the first PIO I think we've had. And it is such a crucial part. And what's really bad here is you have like two PIOs up here with a microphone. So this could get really kind of interesting.
Well,
but
we try to say as little as possible most of the time, though.
Well, so let's talk about a few things. So first of all, I just want to say we really want to engage you in the conversation. So there are mics here. If you have a question, please come forward. Or we can take a microphone to your seat, it looks like. We could do that too. If you like, raise your hand. But in the meantime, Eric and I are going to get started in a little bit of a conversation that hopefully fills in some more information for you. So tell me, first of all, in thinking about who's the right person or what's the right method to communicate and when in a crisis. So we think about, do you put your hospital president out there? Is that the person who should be out there speaking to the media? He or she may want to do that. I think we would caution that you don't want to do that right away. The next issue is, do you think about who's the next best person? And like Eric just said, when I was at the Brigham, I was never on camera. We either had a nurse or an MD answering reporters' questions.
And I'll tell you, at UVA, we're the same way. I'm very rarely on camera. My boss's preference is that for the most part, that we find whoever the expert may be, whether that's a doctor, a nurse, a researcher, our executive vice president for health affairs, whoever it might be, that it's really generally more my role to prep that person for the interview and let them sort of use their knowledge and expertise to really drive the interview. But I think you're right. And I think the right answer to should you put out your hospital president, hospital CEO, I think a lot of it depends on their comfort level. I know our CEO, she's most comfortable speaking on things that she has a deep knowledge about, that she doesn't need a lot of prep for, that if in general, if she feels like if I need to sit down and prep her extensively for how to do an interview, that she feels like she's not the right person to do the interview, and we should let the person who's most knowledgeable do it. But I think that's going to vary, I think that's something that very much varies by institution.
Yeah, I mean, smart hospital presidents that Eric and I have probably come in touch with want the expert in the situation who best understands it to be the person who's out there. And in fact, I would always advise a hospital CEO not to expose himself or herself to a situation that they are not expert in or aware of. Let's talk for a second about the consistency of the message, too. I liked how you said you were right there at the table, because one of the things that we former news people love to do is find inconsistency. So I remember in a few incidents at the Brigham where we had our chief medical officer say to me, geez, I'm saying the same thing to everybody. It's getting boring. And my response back to him was, I don't care. You've got to say the same thing, the same words. Words matter. Talk about the importance of that, too, in keeping that coordinated.
It absolutely does. And I think, in a situation like this, I mean, we made it easier in the sense that and this is really the preference of our hospital leadership, was really to not put anybody really, again, with the one exception I mentioned of me talking to one of the local TV stations, our general preference was we kind of wanted to be, at the periphery of this event. We did not want to make ourselves, a central player in what was happening. So what we really communicated with was really, again, through email, through social media, was through a statement. So there was really, which also does make it, easier for things to not be misconstrued when you're sending it to them in an email. It's on paper, it's on their computer screen. So it makes it much easier to keep that kind of consistent message going. I think and that's especially true in a fluid situation like this, where, your accurate information that's accurate at 11 a.m. may no longer be accurate by noon, as things change, new things happen, patients are released, their conditions change. So it's important to kind of be consistent, knowing that at the next update that afternoon, the message may be entirely different.
Yep. I thought that was very good, too, that you pointed out letting the media know when your next update is. That's very crucial. That's what they want to be fed. Now, keep in mind, in your situation and in many situations, God forbid, let's say there's a fire at your institution. We all know once the fire department gets there and put their boot in your lobby, they're in control of the situation. So how do you coordinate with them? And in your local community, are you, in fact, when you do your tabletops, are you, in fact, drilling out to public safety? Are you taking it out that far when you think about interaction? And how does it work?
Well, we're very fortunate because we have and this is no credit to me, we have very good relationships with the local fire rescue squads. A lot of our emergency medicine physicians serve in medical director roles for our local rescue squads, and so there's already a pretty tight coordination there just on an average day. And so it makes it much easier in these situations because we're already kind of looped in. And certainly when we do some of those, when we do tabletop exercises on a variety of situations, we bring folks in from the local health department, from local fire and rescue squads. We did that a lot. We were one of a few years back when Ebola was a major concern. We were designated by the federal government as one of the nation's Ebola treatment centers. We were one of 2 in Virginia. And we actually have had a few patients who presented with symptoms that we ruled out as patients because they were coming in. I think a couple of them came in through Dulles Airport in DC, and we were one of the closest centers. So they were shipped to us, and I think that situation really highlighted for us the need for that close coordination with certainly the fire and rescue squads, because there's always a chance in a situation like that, or any kind of communicable disease outbreak, and especially now with measles kind of being a hot topic, that in a lot of cases, that's how we're going to find out. We haven't had any measles cases in Charlottesville or in Virginia yet, but odds are pretty good that if we get one, that's how we're going to find out is that, a rescue squad is going to come to our front door with a patient. And so we've our emergency management folks have done a really good job of thinking about how do we bring them in and coordinate with them, because it's incredibly important in those situations, because good coordination with them can head off a whole host of issues before they occur.
And you had a whole other layer of not only police, not only EMT, you had the FBI involved. I think one important takeaway for this group is know your role. Know what's the right thing for you to engage in, because the media will want anyone who's talking to be, it's a soundbite for their story. It's a quote in the newspaper. So know your role. And again, having that consistent channel through the PIO to go out with that information. I think the other thing too that's worth talking about here is media training for, I know I do a bunch of it for some of the Boston hospitals and have done it in the past. That's so important to have, and I would say, I'd be curious in the number of folks you have, but one is not enough, because that one person's going to be on vacation, as we all know, when the incident occurs. 2 may not be enough. Is 3 the right number? Is 4? So think about that internally at your own organizations. You seem to have a pretty good staff, but
we
the
do, and
importance of that.
So the for our department, I think the 2 people, my deputy PIO and I, would be the people if we needed sort of the, I guess for better or worse, sort of the official statement from the health system would be one of us.
Yep.
But again, certainly we've trained, given some training to folks kind of at that, obviously at the very top of the leadership pyramid, and then kind of down through our chief medical officer, our chief of quality and performance improvement, who talks a lot about our efforts to improve patient safety. We have our epidemiologist, who, especially around when we were dealing with potential Ebola cases, he was tremendous, and he's very good on camera. So we're very fortunate to have somebody in that role who is very comfortable talking with the media and is very good at doing it. We have our head of medical toxicology, who we have a poison center based at UVA. So again, another person who has done extensive media interviews and is really good at them. And we don't really need to. He's kind of like you can just kind of wind him up, turn him loose, and he does great, on his own. He could probably come up here and teach some media training to all of us. He's so good at it. But we've tried to sort of get down, sort of even below that layer of like CEO, executive vice president, into that next layer of kind of medical and nursing leadership to try to get them at least familiar and comfortable. So we do need to pull any of them in for interviews or to deliver messages that they can do that. And we'd probably supplement that if we thought it was going to be something challenging or controversial with some additional kind of refresher training right before we send them out to do an interview.
Sure. And think about, you're a 24/7, 365 operation. If something happens in the middle of the night, again, having somebody there who knows how to at least address issues, or also the weekends. One thing I would really encourage, and I heard you say this as well, Eric, when a big event happens, like Charlottesville, everybody comes to town. And I mean everybody. And so Anderson Cooper will be at your front door, and Sean Hannity, and maybe not Sean Hannity, but certainly there'll be those who show up from the national networks. Take care of the local reporters first, because they're going to be there every day, and you're going to want them to cover your good stories as well as your bad stories. The network cables are there to do the bad story, and they leave, and they'll promise you everything. Oh, we'll come back. Oh, I like that story about that researcher. Yeah, I'll give it to a producer in Atlanta, and we'll be back. You won't hear from them again. So take care of local.
Absolutely. We're a relatively small city. We're a relatively small media market, and so as a result, being a big hospital in a small town, we do get a lot of media attention, a lot of inquiries, and they're just a lot of times come to us just looking for stories. And so, right, you're exactly right. Those are the people you're going to be dealing with, 2-3 times a week, long after the event passes, and they remember. They remember how they were treated, and whether they were treated well or they weren't treated well.
Yep. Even the local newspaper reporters.
Yep.
The ones who are there for you every day. Mm-hmm. with the good story that happened, delivery in your hospital that was special for someone. So just keep that in mind. Boy, you and I could go on forever here, but I'm going to keep my eye on the clock here. Tabletop exercises. So I just love to see a show of hands of when you do a tabletop, are PIOs involved in the tabletop exercises? Are they there? Yes? Is that happening? Because one of the things that I want to just stress is the idea of also role-playing, doing some Q&As that I used to do this with my boss at the Brigham. I'd say to him, it only worked once because he's a smart guy, but we were preparing for the infamous Boston Globe Spotlight team. And we went through a number of questions, and I said to him at the end, what's the question you hope they don't ask you? And he said, gee, I hope they don't ask me that. And I said, well, they just did. And he said, yeah, you need to go back to your office and figure out an answer to that question. But think about that as you go along here. I don't want to leave you standing, so fire away. What is your question? And who are you first? Who are you, and where are you from, and what's your question?
I'm from Signature Healthcare. I work in marketing and public relations there. You mentioned something that really helped you was working on internal communications, working really hard at that ahead of time. And I'm just wondering what kind of channels you use to communicate internally, and how did you get employees on board at reading that stuff that you're sending out to them?
Well, I won't claim that we've solved that that challenge. I think that's in, as anybody who works in healthcare knows. I mean, even though I just talked about how healthcare staff have more access to phones and computers than ever before, it's still a challenge to get them to read the internal things. So we hit them a variety of ways. We have our own sort of behind a firewall protected internal news site. We'll use email, and in this case, we actually sent leadership out to kind of round on the units. We armed them with some talking points and just sent them out just to kind of check in with their folks. We had sort of a lot, especially our nursing leadership, we had them out. We had our chief medical officer, we had our executive vice president for health affairs. I think all of them at some point made kind of trips out into the inpatient units just to kind of check in with folks, see how people were doing, see how they were feeling about what was happening, and arm them with some information to kind of answer the questions or concerns that they may have about what was going on, how we were responding, any security questions they may have, so that so we tried to hit them in a variety of different ways to make sure we did our best to reach them and make them feel like they were supported and that they were safe and that they could safely come to and from work.
Picking up on your question, let's talk for a minute about social media. And you really thought this out so well, and kudos to you. But the monitoring of social media, oftentimes we forget that's a real, can be an unfortunate channel of communications that happen in a crisis. You're monitoring it. You had someone, and I thought it was interesting they were remote. Was that a conscious decision, or it's just that's where the person was?
I can't say it was that conscious. We just thought it would be easier. Obviously, the command center, we had a fairly big space for it, but it's it can get kind of full, and it was one of those things where for what she was doing, she didn't need to be there.
Yep.
And really, I think in some ways, sometimes working without all the distraction of the, when you've got 40, 50, 60 people kind of coming in and out of the command center, just doing all the operational things that need to be done. She didn't need to be there. I think she was fine, and we figured, worst case scenario, if we had any kind of, network issue, that we at least had somebody off-site where even if everything, and that wasn't the primary consideration, but even if things went kind of haywire at the hospital for some reason, we had somebody off-site who could still, I could at least maybe all things went completely haywire, I could get on the phone with her, tell her what we needed to push out there, and she could push it out for us. And she was off-site on a separate network, separate Wi-Fi, so that she could go ahead and do that.
Yeah. I thought that was very smart. I thought that was a very, very good idea.
And I'll add that I think, in a lot of cases, the social media folks a lot of times are sort of your early warning system. They're going to, even before maybe you hear from your own staff or from the media, you may get questions even just from, people out in the community via social media that, sort of require you to think about, how are we going to respond to this? And it can kind of be an early warning system to, keep you aware of what people are thinking and sort of what you might get later from reporters, because I think increasingly now, reporters are looking to social media for story ideas and for the thoughts of the community. So it's a great way to kind of anticipate that before you actually get it from a reporter in the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, your name and where you're from.
I'm Lorraine McGrath. I'm a Director of Marketing and Communications for Signature Healthcare. My question is, while everybody in your department has a specific role that you've planned out in advance and doing important work for communications and trying to communicate with the media and employees, how are you controlling the influx of the reporters and cameramen that are descending upon your facility, and who and how do you control that?
So we get a lot of help at our institution from the university has a police force, and we have a dedicated group of security officers who are assigned to the medical center. And so what we talk about, and this is this is driven by a lot of times by our operational needs, where what we will say is, okay, we're going to set up, if we need to, like I mentioned that we set up triage in our lobby. And so based on that, we said, okay, we're going to set up essentially a perimeter around the hospital, and we're going to close down. Again, we have one road, Lee Street, that kind of runs right through the middle of our medical center. And so what we had security officers at both ends of that street. If you were an ambulance, you could get through, and if you weren't, you didn't. And we had officers at most of the major entrances to the medical center. We've actually now, and this was something we put in place a couple of years ago, we do have a lot of entry points to the hospital, but now almost, I think with the exception of, 4 or 5 of them, maybe 6, you need an ID badge to swipe to get in. And so if you don't have a badge, you can't get in most of those entrances. And for the other 4 or 5, 6 entrances, we had security officers there. And obviously if they saw somebody toting a TV camera, all those officers had my business card, and I just told them to call me, tell them you need to direct them to the Grove Street parking lot, which happens to be, and we have a very, the layout of our medical center complex is kind of funky. We have 2 sets of railroad tracks that run through it. It's the weirdest looking complex, but the nice thing is behind one set of the tracks is a parking lot that we use for some of our staff. And so you've got the tracks between the parking lot and the hospital. It gives you this wonderful view of the helipad and the emergency room, which are also set so far back you can't actually see anything. So we told all the security officers, essentially, if you see reporters, you see people attempting to talk to people, just direct them to Grove Street, call me. I'll come either directly to you and meet them and escort them there myself, or you can escort them there, or just tell them to call me, and I will come talk with them and meet whatever, or at least attempt to meet whatever need they have. So a lot of it is not our department. We really sort of use our security force to help us kind of enforce that perimeter and kind of keep people from going where we don't want them to go.
So a little more information for you on that as well too is you set the space for the media. You direct them. So now you should have a spot at your hospital where the media should go. So nowadays the media get out 2 ways. One is, 3 ways. So they have the old typical microwave truck that is kind of going out of style. 2 is they now have a cell phone backpack that allows them to pretty much go live anywhere. It's about 10 cell phones that they generate that are able to send a video signal back, and they can go live from anywhere. And the final one is satellite. So if you ever get something with the big networks or some of the Boston stations, they may send a satellite truck down. They need to be able to see the southwest sky clearly to be able to broadcast out. Southwest sky is where the satellites are. So all things to consider, but have something in advance set up so you can greet them. And the last thing I'll say to you is, and there was nothing in your question that indicated this, I just want to say this to the group, they're not your enemy. They actually can be helpful to you in getting a message out. So the better you work with them, the better they'll work with you. So, yes, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Hank Leip, the Emergency Management Director for the town of Plymouth. I don't know how Jim Cantori and the satellite crew gets that southwest when there's thunder snow.
Well, the problem is he doesn't. He has. It's called rain fade that he gets. Yes, yeah.
My question revolves around the integration of communication, and thank you so much for all of the excellent information. It's been great. The Plymouth 400 is coming up in 2020. There's a lot of events, and if I didn't have if I had hair left, it would be falling out. Integration of communications. You have the Emergency Operations Center for the city of Charlottesville, probably. I don't know if that's where you were. You said you were at EOC, but I don't know which one. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Then you have the scene where everybody wants to be, and they want the backdrops, and they want the shots. And then you have your individual at her house with social media who's monitoring. And then you might have a few other places where you're trying to, where information is coming from. And you're having to integrate all of this information to make sure that it's accurate and that you validate it. Can you give us some guidance on about the challenges that you have had with your two events and making sure that the information before you put it out is consistent and it's confirmed? And one other part, the challenge with social media when you had bad information and how to turn that around.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with the.
Well, you started with really easy questions.
Yeah, no,
really.
It got progressively harder. Yeah. I'll start with your last question around sort of how do you counter the bad social media. I think it's obviously it's challenging, and I think that again that's one of the good things about having a social media coordinator. She uses all sorts of kind of listening tools that frankly I'm not expert in, so I'm the wrong person to ask about. I just know that she does it and does it well, and I trust her to do it. But I think that's a lot of times where you can sort of seek that out if you've got some sort of social media listening service that will you'll do some keyword. Essentially, what it does a whole bunch of keyword searches in real time for what's out there, and then lets you kind of respond to that. But I think it goes back to some of what Peter said before, and just having that that consistent message just kind of repeated over and over and over again, and making sure that whether it's the media or the public knows that you have a verified, whether it's a verified Twitter account, a verified Facebook page for your institution, knowing that you have that, and that's where you can go for official trusted information. In terms of the communication challenges and sort of making sure your information is accurate, for us it was a little bit easier in the sense that my focus during these events was pretty narrow, where we were focused solely on who are the patients that have come to UVA and what are we doing to take care of them, where I wasn't responsible for kind of the university-wide response to this. I was responsible for sort of the health systems portion of it. I was responsible for answering the questions about the patients we were treating. So I personally didn't face a lot of challenges. I think the challenge was kind of coordinating, because obviously we're very focused on operationally what we're doing to take care of patients and kind of keep the rest of the hospital up and running, where obviously this was a major event. And so on kind of what we call the academic side of the university, kind of the non-health system portion of the university, they're having to work as well to make some of their own decisions about how the rest of the university is going to operate that day. And I think that was a big challenge. And I think that just speaks to the the complexity of a big UVA has now I think approaching 20,000 students. We employ about 11,000 people at the health system when we put all of our entities together, and I think the academic side employs even more people than that. So trying to coordinate all those messages for different groups with different needs, it's an ongoing challenge for us, because we serve such different populations. Whereas a good example of that would be like when we get our one snowfall of the year and we get a foot of snow, and it's Virginia, and we're not really we're not Massachusetts. We're not used to dealing with the snow. So a lot of times the academic side of the school will close, but we're a hospital, and so we're always open. And so it's just that communication. That's a good example of the challenge we face, is that we've got different audiences with different needs, different messages, and how do you coordinate that to make sure that everybody's getting the right message for them? And I think that's an ongoing challenge that we're going to forever be working on how to address that best.
As an old hockey player, there's a line, skate your lane. And getting people to understand what their lane is and to stay in that can be helpful. Just a couple of points just for this audience I want to touch upon, things you mentioned, but just to emphasize perhaps. Remember, in Boston now, the news starts on their clock, not on yours. The news in Boston starts at 4:30 in the morning, and reporters are out at scenes at 4:30 in the morning, probably 3:30 to be prepared. And the news nowadays in Boston, I think there's actually a newscast every hour except for maybe 11 to noon if you factor in every station in town. Well, actually, if you include New England Cable News, we're really on from 4:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night, with some station doing news in the market. So just know that you may want to take a break, but the media isn't necessarily ready to do that. So telegraphing again when you're available, I think is good. And one last thing, going back to your point about internal communications, I think it's important to just keep in mind the importance of getting out an internal message, because one of the things I found at an incident at the Brigham once was employees tweet. You know, if there's some issue at the hospital, they're concerned, they want to get to their loved ones. So they tweet, and their friends tweet, or they post, and before you know it, you've got a bad storyline out there. So there is no such thing as internal communications. That doesn't exist anymore. So take advantage of your communications to get your message out clearly and consistently.
And Peter, I'll add to that. I think what we always think about when we're talking about internal communication is that, as you said, these days, emails can be forwarded, people can tweet about it, people can share it. You've got to be very consistent, I think, in really saying, you would not want to say anything to your own staff that you would not want on the front page of the paper. And it's got to be, whatever you would tell a reporter is the same thing that you're telling your staff and vice versa. That it has to be consistent, because again, as you said before, reporters will always seize on inconsistency. And if you hand it to them on a silver platter, you're just making it all the much easier for them.
Yep. You and I can go on for another 20 minutes,
Yeah.
but we've got to take a break and move to our next speaker. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Round of applause.